Our first speaker this afternoon is Diana Slattery, PhD. Diana Reed Slattery's writing career began with poetry and fiction in the print world, publishing in magazines and journals such as Georgia Review, New England Review, and Breadloaf Quarterly, Fiction International, Antioch Review, Exile, Groundswell, and Kansas Quarterly. She has been anthologized in New World Writing, New Campus Writing, Outlaw Visions, and Golden Horses. Her story, Bizarre Births, from 1988, was included in the Georgia Review's finalist entry for National Magazine Award. In the same time period, she received an honorable mention in the Pushcart Prize for short fiction and in the Best American Short Stories. Her short story collection, Bizarre Truths, was a finalist for the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. Diana's going to talk about the psychedelic origins of language, a fascinating topic. And, you know, bring somebody who's got a literary background is just another example of the diffusion of psychedelics out of the medical community and into the broader world.
So this is the origin of language slide. And the fact is that nobody knows what the origin of language is. Many, many people have speculated. You can't really do much more than speculate because there's no material evidence for speech acts. But speculate we will always do, and it's been my favorite philosophical question for I don't know how long, which is where do the words come from? And we're swept away by language into the human community. We swim in language. Our thoughts, plans, the stories we form about who we are and what our place is in the world, they're all built of language. Language stores our memories. We're filled to the brim with language. We have labels for sensations, ideas, feelings. So immersed, where can we stand to be able to actually view language? How can language talk about itself? It's a completely self-reflexive activity. And it's the same problem as looking at consciousness. Is how does consciousness take itself for an object and look at itself? It's not easy, and it's one of the reasons that consciousness gets so strangely treated by both the philosophic and the scientific communities, in trying to define it or explain it, or in the case of Daniel Dennett, explain it away. So to study the relationship of language and consciousness is to examine the relationship of two deeply self-reflexive activities. So here's some of the things we don't know about language. How, when, and where did it originate? We can talk about it, but we can only talk about it in relation to both biology and culture, because they interact. McKenna's stoned ape theory, of course, is the idea that when we were, climbed down out of the trees, we're early hominids, we're out there foraging, we come across mushrooms or other psychedelic substances, we eat them, we experience what we experience, and culture in some fashion arises from that, and McKenna feels that even language arises from that because of his own experiences with especially DMT and the linguistic creatures. This is really important. There's nothing natural about natural language. Okay, we all get it installed. Okay, this is my favorite picture of the installation of language, and it's an alchemical picture. And there you have, the Hebrew language, actually the word of God, the unspeakable word of God, downloading into this interesting figure, which is a heart. It's an alembic. It's also the whole body because the arms are coming out of it. And so language is pouring down in with, a little angel flaming the, with the bellows on the side. But it is installed. If you don't install it in your children and nobody else does, they can't speak. So I did 3 parts of my research that the book that I did on this is kind of divided this way. The first part is on psychonautics and on practices. And the second part is the maps and models from neurophenomenology particularly. And the third is what I call xenolinguistics. And in science fiction, xenolinguistics means the study of alien languages. And I like it to talk about the languages that we see in psychedelic states. So psychonautics it's really helpful to kind of know what myth you're living in. And psyche, from which we get the word psychedelics and psychonautics and other words, goes back to the Greek, and it used to mean the whole package: mind, soul, spirit, breath, life, all in one thing. And whatever happened to that? So psychonaut, nautis is the word for sailor, so we're actually like soul sailors. And the myth, Psyche, was a very beautiful mortal woman. And she was so beautiful that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, got very jealous, and she sent her son Eros to go and shoot Psyche with one of his arrows. Now, his arrows had the effect of making whoever, if she were struck by the arrow, the next thing or person that she saw, she would fall in love with. And the idea was to have her fall in love with a monster, which was the prophecy that surrounded her. So anyhow, he goes off, he finds Psyche, he takes one look at her, he's so stunned and flummoxed that he just drops the arrow, pricks himself, like self-reflexive, falling in love, and he takes off. And he's madly in love with Psyche now, so the whole thing backfired. She is put on top of a mountaintop by her father as a sacrifice to the gods for being too pretty. And Eros sweeps her up, puts her in a palace. She's served by invisible hands. She can't see him at all. She's not allowed to see him. And he takes her to bed, and it's totally dark. And again, he's still scared of his mother. So he tells her that he can't put any light, and she's not to try to see the face of love. So naturally she tries, and she brings a lamp in while she's sleeping, spills the lamp oil, he wakes up, he banishes her, and through many trials they are finally reunited. And Psyche and Eros, Psyche is seeking the face of love, and Eros needs a soul to fill. So that's the mythical underpinnings. That's what we're doing to some degree in psychonautics. So, Richard Doyle defines psychonautics as the human investigation of psyche through unavoidably first-person science. He wrote a wonderful book called Darwin's Pharmacy. So with psychedelics, we return to psyche over and over as psychonauts, as soul sailors, to psyche in this larger sense. And we're beginning the mythical rediscovery, I think, of the mythical and the mystical and the magical dimensions of psyche in its fullness. So as Neil was saying, psychonautics has been integrated with a number of other practices, healing practices and everything you can read on the screen. But psychonautics is used in combination. On my own practice, I call it a noetic practice because I was basically out there looking for some particular knowledge and knowledge about language. So we're a medicine community. That means we're a community of practice. We have many practices, and practices are defined by doing. Theorizing comes out of practice. And practice is, Sufi dancing is a practice. Kung Fu is a practice. Optometry is a practice. So we return to psyche again and again. And it's repetitive, you gain knowledge, and therefore psychonautics can be a site for research, the first-person science. That said, there's not one practice. I think everyone in this room might have their own protocol if you really thought about it, how you go about psychonautics. And I'm very wary of, anyone who says, this is the way to do it, or that is the way to do it. It's very much in my estimation, something one seeks in oneself and finds the best practice for you. So language, language is used, it goes into very much the set of your trip. Everything you've read, everything a friend has told you, everything you've thought of yourself is going into that set, and it's all linguistic. One of the fascinating things is that on a high enough dose of whatever, you can actually go beyond natural language. And if you don't experience it as a deficit, but as a wonderful freedom from every structure that's built out of natural language, it's really quite an experience. Another example would be in ayahuasca ceremonies, if the shaman is using Icaros, that's another very powerful linguistic management of a psychedelic state. Benny Shannon, who wrote that book, The Antipodes of the Mind, which is a phenomenology of ayahuasca experience, says there's no replacing first-hand experience, and not little toe-dabbling experience, but intensive, long-term experience. So psychonautics, it's kind of a risky business, and it's got an odd set of risks. I mean, there's the obvious risk of the legal status and of how that affects your own set. There's a chilling effect on research proceeding in a war zone. That's very hard to get funding. All the funding so far for above ground research is it's private for the main part. You have the risks of self-experimentation, and which have a lot to do with a whole set of fears. Like a fear of getting caught, a fear of loss of control, fear of going out and not coming back, fear of getting stuck in a bad trip, fear of coming back to baseline and discovering this is a really bad trip, fear of identity dissolution and psychosis. So here we have, that was Saint Teresa in ecstasy. Here's the full picture. Interestingly enough, she looks like she's in the exact same situation as Psyche and Eros. So here comes Eros again to Saint Teresa, about to plunge a golden dart deep into her heart and entrails, which is the description she made of this experience. But ecstasy, so ecstasy is usually thought of as losing reason, right? You're in this completely unreasonable state. And I'd like to just give you the idea that ecstasy is actually the beginning of reason, not the death of reason. And the reason I think that is from going into ecstatic states and enjoying a completely new form of thinking, of being able to think without my ego structure getting in the way of telling me what I ought to be thinking, or what somebody else thought about that, or is this an okay thought, or my body is feeling absolutely pain-free and lovely. I mean, that's a much better state to be in to learn anything. But it's also, if you look at the meaning of the word ecstasy, it's ecstasis. It means standing outside. It's the beginning of objectivity, of true objectivity. So I'll just leave you with that thought. So second, methodological problems. The biggest one I see for all of us, whether psychonauts or above ground research or whatever, is, I call it premature interpretation. And the experience, it gets so, it's so engrossing, it's so different, it's so what we want to talk about it, but it also gives us a lot of ontological anxiety, and we want to immediately say, it was this, or it was this neurotransmitter, or it was quantum this, and instead of just staying with the absolute mystery of this is the weirdest thing that ever happened to me. So this causes different effects in terms of being able to communicate the experience meaningfully to others in a way that it comes out more than just traveler's tales. So we have, so you get the problem with withholding data. That sounds too weird. I don't want to write that down. I don't even want to write it down in my journal because I'm embarrassed. I made a prophetic remark and I sound like a fool. And so that's part of the reporting is interesting and difficult. We have, that you have the feeling that's too crazy sounding, you're trying to protect your reputation, and you have state-bound memory of, how much can you actually bring back. But, phenomenological rigor suffers when you can't say what happened. So, big part of it. So then you get all this, high dose, I call it high dose heroics, and low dose toe dabbling, and tourist behavior, and all kinds of things like that. So this is how I was building up by saying Psychonautics is a site for research. So it was a site actually for my PhD research, and this is how I did it. Those are, psychedelic self-exploration, software design, and writing. So here, this is my instrumentation. The last one is a Wii remote, because I designed, with the language that came to me, I designed various pieces of software. And the last piece was so I could control it gesturally, because it was originally a gestural language. Okay. There's just a couple notes on the mystery of the other. This is one of the things that becomes very difficult sometimes to report. Unless you're in a context, a different cultural context, where to meet and speak with a spirit is a totally normal thing, okay? If you're just on your own, in our culture, meeting and speaking with disincarnate entities of whatever, shape or form, and there are many, is often, called schizophrenia. So those are some of the forms that the other shows up in. This is Pablo Amaringo, of course. The others can be benign, frightening, wonderful. It's a drawing by Kat Harrison. I love this mushroom shaman. And this one came out of me in a session, and it always reminded me of Kat's drawing. Yeah. I'm sorry. 5 minutes? Okay. Neil, 5 minutes before Q&A or 5 minutes period? Thanks. Okay, we're almost there. So neurophenomenology was the core of how I looked at this topic. I'm not going to even try to explain other than what neurophenomenology does in its goal is to match or to make sense out of both the neurological data combined with the subjective data of experience of any kind of state of consciousness, but also altered states of consciousness. So those are some of the things I got into. So xenolinguistics, study of non-human or alien languages, is what I call this stuff. So I love this quote of Maria Sabina's. One of the principal ones spoke to me and said, Maria Sabina, this is the book of wisdom. It is a book of language. So that's a lot of her beautiful spontaneous speaking was coming from that primary linguistic experience. Henry Munz went down and studied with Maria Sabina and studied in that culture. And I like this so much. Language is an ecstatic activity of signification. And certainly the mushrooms create in some extreme conditions of eloquence. So here's a slide of one of the xenolinguists in the people that I've studied. And it's this incredible tattoo that this couple, Carolyn and Gaetan Cotero Miro, made. They did a year discipline of taking Perganum harmala, Syrian rue, once a day, 6 days a week, both of them, during which time she did the drawing for this and also tattooed it on his back. These are some of the themes that come up in people experiencing these kind of languages. Thinking about the origin of language, glossolalia, all these type of things. You can kind of read down them. But there's a lot of commonality when you talk to people experiencing language things. This is the three-dimensional writing instrument that I made called Live Glide, where I can write in 3 dimensions using this symbol system. This is just a little bit about, this is kind of geeky, but Time Wave Zero, Terence McKenna's, I consider that a totally linguistic invention. And it derives from the I Ching. And the glide system also connects to the I Ching in a completely different way, but I found that fascinating that when you put the hexagrams in motion and you put the glyphs in motion, you know, the hexagrams of the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, it's all about changes and one thing metamorphizing into others. Okay, this is that's my book, my novel, The Maze Game, which is all about language. The book about language and consciousness is coming out next year, and there's also an iPad app made out of this language. That's my website. And now I'm going to take questions, and there's going to be a slideshow playing in the back of more of the artwork of these different wonderful people. So here come all the messages in the bottle. Okay, questions? Thank you.
The last thing you mentioned was like the I Ching, and then earlier I noticed you mentioned noetic sciences, you know, and the question of like how language comes into play with noetic sciences. And Dean Radin, who, you know, is like one of the pioneers of noetic sciences, has been working with the Global Consciousness Project that uses random number generators to sort of like monitor the collective consciousness depending on the current events of the time. So you can tell by a skew in the probability, it generates ones or zeros. So you can tell based on skew and probability if there's something abnormal happening, is the idea. And I'm really interested in noetic sciences as well, and I've been working with this invention which is kind of along the same lines as the I Ching, and it's a random word generator. So for example, during the course of your talk, I have it on my phone. So I asked just like, you know, 2 or 3 questions, and and you just ask it in your mind, you know, you can type it in, but the input isn't based on the words that you type in. So like I typed it in on my phone, have it on record. My question was psychedelic language origination, ? And the answer was outgoing, converse, with journal, exhausted. So I thought it was like out of 6,500 words, the fact that converse with came up with, there's a couple short phrases, like, you know, converse with, it's one entry. So I asked psychedelic language origination, and the answer was outgoing, converse with, journal, exhaustive. So, and I thought there was some kind of zen in that reading, because outgoing is the first word, converse with the second word, and then the third word is journal. So I feel like a journal is more like introspective. So it's sort of like the opposite of outgoing, which was the first word, which is, you know, and so my question to you is like, how do you feel that language relates to like chaos theory? Like, how do words come to be to begin with?
How do they come to be?
Yeah, like how do we decide this is the word for whatever? Like,
well,
you know?
When I was in the 4th grade, I don't know the answer to that question. I've been thinking about it for a long time, because I sat there in a 4th grade class all of a sudden I became aware that sentences were coming out of my mouth and I had no idea how they were getting formed. And it was really disturbing. It's like, who was cranking out the words and putting them all together? It's deeply mysterious because, here I am, blah, 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 and it's just coming out.
How would you address the apparent paradox in the psychedelic origin of language, in that psychedelics tend to have an effect on eliminating the distinctions between things, whereas language is the faculty of establishing distinctions between things?
Give me that last part again.
Psychedelics usually dissolve distinctions between things, whereas language is the faculty of establishing distinctions between things. How would you address that paradox?
Well, that's exactly the point, because by the time we've installed all this language and we put labels on everything, and this was established very well mythically in Eden. God said, go out and name everything. So man became the namer of things. But by the time we have plastered all these signs, it's like a botanical garden that has sticky notes all over it or something, and can we really see through our own labels, our own distinctions, whatever. Now, what I have experienced, and I think is a possible experience, is to be able to go out beyond natural language and its functioning. And you're still thinking, my God, there's cognition. There's a whole different kind, and you have to sort of go and see. That's how, but you're right, it's the exact, language can become exactly what's between us and a direct experience of the world.
Recently, I've been getting a lot into the way insects communicate through chemicals, because the concept of subjective and objective perception of what is being transferred is a topic I've been revolving around the past couple of days. I just wondered if that ringed a bell, or if you had anything to apply to that, because I feel like objective perception is like you're saying, stepping out of ourselves and perceiving what it is. Other than what we think it is. I was saying the alien linguistics, would that be more of objective or subjective? I felt like that was more in the objective spectrum. That picture, I perceive that picture, I can't interpret it, it's just my subjective.
You mean, are you asking about subjectivity and objectivity in psychonautic experience?
Yes.
Okay, here's how I see it. We have a whole set of meanings, and we have a lot of arguments around subjectivity and objectivity in science. And there's a whole set of, what's really an objective observation? I went and studied chemistry. Did that teach me objectivity? What exactly is that practice? And on the subjective end, the whole thing with studying consciousness is, it is first-person experience. I mean, you're not going to get it unless I tell you, or if you don't tell someone what that experience is, it's not, it can't be shared or looked at or studied or whatever. But once you take the psychedelic, that entire set of linguistic distinctions about subjectivity and objectivity tend to fall apart, because the subject, number one, is shifting. Well, who do you think the subject is? Your sense of self. What is it? Ego dissolution, whatever you call it. Stuff is dropping away. So my sense of self as the scientific observer who I was back at baseline, now I'm here, it's a whole different thing. Objectivity is a different thing. Observation is a different thing. And the things that we're observing are different. Brian Josephson, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, he just, shocked everyone by going off and studying parapsychology. And he said, we would know more things if we could observe more things. And believe it or not, psychedelics certainly give you more things to observe. So that's what I have to say about it. Thanks.
So it's clear that and first, thank you for making this fun. Thank you for that. It's clear that you like playing with this kind of technology, or with extra human technology. Yeah. And what do you see our relationship to that being in terms of our defining this evolutionary step in the relationship between consciousness and language, in being able to define what consciousness and language is by growing it with technology?
Okay, I love that question, thank you. This is the most amazing linguistic machine that we've ever invented. It is a machine that totally handles multiple layers of language, from zeros and ones at the machine level up through assembly level and all the higher level languages. It is so complex. Every one of those languages is a new language. You know, we're talking the last 50 years, and they keep proliferating. So we've got this huge linguistic diversity going into this basic thing, this universal, I can do anything machine. As far as the culture, if you've read the book, What the Dormouse Said, there's a great deal of psychedelics implied and involved in the early technological developments in all over the place, but particularly Silicon Valley. And I personally see that our entire cultural language and sense of language and use of language is shifting toward the visual, and has everything to do with this machine, because this machine can process visual information, you know, magnificently and rapidly. And we're getting, you know, look at how much YouTube is being watched and created. We're shifting, we're communicating much more with the visual, even if it's just a talking head. We're showing the person. So yeah, it's like, I mean, I don't know, how many stoned programmers do you know? I know a lot. And they're out there making amazing things, you know. It's got a lot to do. There's an influence. There's a definite strong influence in our culture. So,
Diana Slattery, thank you very, very much.